Premier Daniel Smith announced $8.6 billion aimed at building more schools and creating around 200,000 new spaces for students over the next 7 years. Now, to chat about this huge initiative in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, this is one of the largest infrastructure plans in Alberta history, and the plan will apparently be financed by taking on loans?
Yeah, so that's maybe the part that people might be less enthused about, let's say. I don't think anyone is particularly opposed to building more schools. I think it's fairly obvious at this point that schools are pretty overcrowded. And also this is not, a particularly new problem. I remember more than 30 students per class when I was in elementary school 30 years ago. So this is not a particularly new problem, but this is the latest crack at solving it, shall we say. Now that 8.6 billion it's going to be over 7 years, so it's not like this expenditure is sort of all going to come at one point, but it does seem to be financed by loans. And the other thing that's going to happen here, which is actually a bit of a change from the way the province normally builds schools, is that the province is going to retain ownership of the schools and lease them to school boards instead of dispersing grants to school boards to build schools. The benefit of this seems to be that you could approve and build projects sort of over the course of the year without requiring, annual budget writing, annual budget season being the time when this money goes out. So it might sort of make this process flow a little more easily over the course of a given year. Not going to be happening super soon. Obviously there are all sorts of things that need to happen before a school can be built. Land needs to be found, plans need to be drawn up, all that kind of stuff. And so school boards are supposed to be looking into that in the next little bit. But, a massive, massive expenditure, and the Premier took to television last night to lay that out before Albertans. I don't know, a Premier's address to the province isn't usually used for something like a spending announcement. So it was a bit of an interesting twist on the subjects that are normally brought up during those sorts of things. But anyways, massive spending, clearly a huge overhaul in parts of the education system, and I guess we'll see how it turns out. There's always a bit of trouble in terms of financing developments and things like that, so I'm sure people will be keeping a close eye on that.
Alberta and BC, Tyler, are now in an alignment on a major aspect of drug policy, and that would be involuntary addictions treatment. Now, it turns out that British Columbia may actually be providing some guidance to the Alberta government.
Well, it looks that way. So what has happened in the past week is that both John Rustad, the leader of the BC Conservatives, and David Eby, the Premier of British Columbia and the NDP leader, have both sort of backed this idea of involuntary drug treatment. And this is not the first time BC has sort of flirted with this idea. In 2020, John Horgan, the former BC Premier, had brought forth legislation that would have allowed the involuntary treatment of minors. That died actually in 2021 when an election was called, and it hasn't really come back. And Eby in particular sort of waffled on it over the years. But what we do have now is alignment between the Conservatives and the NDP in BC, which is very strange, you might think, on something like this. But what Eby proposed last week is a relatively clear policy. I mean, I think there's some wiggle room there and up for debate parts of it, but relatively clear. And what he said was that those who are suffering from mental illness, severe drug addiction, and brain injury are going to be the people sort of captured by this possibility of being involuntarily confined to a secure facility for treatment. We have not heard that sort of precision in Alberta, I don't think. We've talked about people who are a threat to themselves and to others, people with severe drug addiction who should be forced into treatment. But those three things, the brain injury, the addiction, and the mental health, it has not as yet been as much a component of what Alberta is considering. And of course, this was proposed back in 2023 during the election, and there hasn't been legislation yet. It's still in consultation and figuring it out sort of phases as far as I know. But kind of interesting to see where BC is at and where Alberta is at. And of course, BC has an election in, I think, 4 or so weeks. So this is doubtless going to be a major topic on the campaign trail over there, and it'll be worth watching from an Alberta perspective because we might be keeping an eye on them for coming up with some ideas about what to do.
Absolutely. Last week, news broke that the Trudeau government was looking over a plan to share asylum seekers among all the provinces, Tyler. The majority would allegedly be heading to Ontario and Quebec, but there was talk of 28,000 coming to Alberta, but Premier Smith said, hey, we simply don't have the capacity right now to bring in that many more people. I mean, we already have seen a population increase here in Alberta of 200,000 since last year. I guess maybe the Alberta is Calling campaign really worked out?
Well, depending on what one wanted as the outcome, it's worked out. There's certainly been a lot of people coming to Alberta, and perhaps too many people, at least from the perspective of the government. But back in July, all the premiers had they call it the Council of the Federation, when all the premiers meet and they talk about issues facing the premiers. Usually they ask for things like more money for healthcare, and I think they did again this year. But one of the things they asked for was a more equitable and fair distribution of asylum seekers. There's more than 200,000, I think about 230,000 asylum seekers currently in Canada. So these are people that are in the early stages of the refugee application process, and they apply when they come here, and they're sort of in a bit of a limbo until their asylum requests are rejected or accepted. Now, most of them are currently in BC and Ontario, in Quebec and Ontario, I should say, which sort of makes sense. Montreal and Toronto have two of the biggest airports in the country. It just sort of makes sense. But the federal government has been sort of talking with some of the premiers about what a more fair distribution of these people might look like. And Quebec in particular has asked the federal government to send asylum seekers elsewhere. So if that sort of idea was adopted, if asylum seekers were distributed on a per capita basis, then every province except for Quebec and Ontario would get more asylum seekers. You'd lose about 15 to 20,000 from those two provinces, and other provinces would gain a bunch more. Obviously, this has been really controversial. New Brunswick has spoken out against it. Alberta's spoken out against it, basically saying that look at the state of our public services. I mean, we just talked about schools being overcrowded and needing billions of dollars in investment. Similar situation with healthcare. And obviously, housing is becoming a bit of an issue in parts of Alberta as well. So super controversial. It doesn't seem like this is, going ahead immediately. There does seem to be a lot of back and forth between the federal government and the provinces, but something to keep an eye on, because the population growth in Alberta is obviously significant and creating some challenges for the province as well.
Do we know where the bulk of these asylum seekers are originating from? Is it Ukraine, maybe the Gaza Strip? What do we know so far?
Well, they do seem to come from a bunch of places. Now, there was the sort of big crush of Ukrainian refugees that came at a certain point, and a lot of those ended up in Alberta, actually, which it sort of makes sense because there's a lot of historical ties to Ukraine in Alberta. I think we have the largest Ukrainian population in the country, so it does make sense that a lot of those people came here with some connection. There would be data on where everybody had come from. I believe a lot are coming from South America at this point. But I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what the exact breakdown was.
Tyler, the UCP will be holding its annual convention on November the 1st and 2nd, I believe. Now, you actually got your hands on an early version of potential policy resolutions that may be discussed. What really jumped out for you?
Well, a few things really jumped out. This is the sort of unedited list, shall we say. It was really, really long, like maybe 50 or 60 different resolutions. And what happened was they all went out to the party's members 2 weeks ago, and members had 2 weeks to rank what they thought were the most important, their top priorities. And then the party sort of takes the top ranked ones and they end up for public debate at the convention in a month and a half here. So it's a bit of a Wild West as a result. And the ones that jumped out at me were the big one, actually, that really jumped out at me was the suggestion that Alberta should get strong mayor legislation like Ontario. As it is in every city and town in Alberta, the mayor is just sort of one vote on the council. Of course, they have a little bit of authority but it's really the bully pulpit. Their vote counts for no more than any other councillor. Strong mayor legislation would change that to some extent. It would give the mayor some veto powers, for example. It could give the mayors more direct budget making power as opposed to a committee writing budgets, things like that. So that one, if that's adopted, that could have some pretty significant changes or effects, I should say, on the way that municipal government works in the province. And then there were some other sort of social issues, shall we say, that caught my eye. Because what's always interesting, I think, with conservative parties is the extent that social conservatives, successfully bring their issues up and have them incorporated into policy. If we look at the Stephen Harper years, that's the perfect example of social conservatives not really getting very far, despite working pretty hard at it. And times have maybe shifted a little bit. So there are some new policies around female-only spaces, for example, in bathrooms and change rooms, things like that. These are not wildly different from policy that's already been adopted. There is one resolution that would seek to not fund third trimester abortions, which are very rare as it is in Alberta. but you can imagine that the NDP will be quite worked up about that. And the same thing with private healthcare. There's a resolution that says that Albertans should be able to seek private surgical procedures if there's too many delays in the public system. Again, this is the sort of thing the NDP loves to fight about, even if it's maybe not that controversial of a proposal for a lot of people. So it's really interesting just seeing where the constituency associations around the province started. What things did they think were the most important issues facing Alberta? And then we'll see in a couple weeks here when the final list comes out, what did the party's membership overall think was important? And that will lead to the debate at the convention. So it's a bit of a how the sausage is made kind of process, but pretty interesting nonetheless.
Tyler, our province's energy minister, Brian Jean, has discussed the potential that oil and gas companies may need public money to clean up orphan wells. Now, that could be quite the tab in the tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah, this is always really controversial when it comes up. And the reason for that is oil and gas producers are legally obligated to reclaim their used up wells. They don't really get to just leave them and walk away. But there are hundreds of them, thousands of them around the province, and the total cost to clean them all up, the estimates are massive. I think they range from about 50 or 60 billion to 350 billion, something like that. And they haven't really, I mean, the number of them has been reduced in recent years, but it is a very, very slow process. And so what Brian Jean was saying is, look, if this needs to get done, maybe we need to find some way to make it easier for the oil and gas sector. Maybe there needs to be reductions in their municipal tax rate. Maybe there needs to be the lightening of some regulatory burdens so that they get this done. Of course, rural municipalities are furious about this. They're saying, well, why should we cut their taxes when they're not fulfilling their legal obligations to clean these things up? So hard to say exactly where that's going to go. There are a couple sort of similar policy programs out there already that have been controversial, but any further travel down this road, shall we say, is I think going to be very, very controversial, because I think the populist instincts of Albertans are maybe opposed to giving taxpayer money to big business to clean up after themselves.
Now, speaking of controversies, let's chat a bit about Alberta pulling out of the CPP. Now, talk of Alberta pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan and walking away with around $300 billion has kind of been put on ice for now. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so back when this first came up, the provincial government got a report that said they would be entitled to, I think the specific number is $343 billion, but it's more than half of the entire CPP's assets, is what this report concluded that Alberta was due if it pulled out to start its own pension plan. And the government really trumpeted that. They said, look at all this money, look at all the benefits that Albertans could have. We could pay out more to retirees, working Albertans would have to contribute less. It's a win-win for everybody. This was obviously really controversial. And the Alberta government doesn't really just get to walk away with that money without a little bit of negotiation with the federal government and other provinces. And so where it is at currently is the provincial government is waiting on Ottawa's sort of return estimate. If Alberta says, we think we get 334 billion, whatever it was, well, what is the federal government going to say? Are they going to say 100 billion? Are they going to say 50 billion? Are they going to say 250? We just don't know. And so the process is just sort of paused until we find out what the federal government is going to say. Because obviously, if it's significantly less, if all of the benefits of having more than 300 billion wouldn't be there because that number is smaller, there's a good chance that plan gets scrapped. If that number is also humongous, then maybe the plan goes forward. So we're just sort of waiting on that, and then I would expect that to flare up again at some point in the next couple months here, and once we have that number.
Here in Lethbridge, Tyler, the Alberta NDP chose their candidate for the Lethbridge West by-election. It became available when Shannon Phillips stepped away from public life back in July. Now, former City Councillor Rob Miyashiro is the new candidate, and the UCP will be choosing its candidate next Monday, and the frontrunner so far is former Lethbridge Police Chief and current City Councillor John Middleton Hope. Interesting times ahead here in our city, and this is a riding that both the UCP and NDP will be pushing for.
Yeah, very much a battleground riding, and very much a riding that people are going to be watching quite closely to see sort of where the political winds are blowing in Alberta right now. This is going to be a big test, I think, for Naheed Nenshi's for his NDP. This was an NDP riding for, I think, since 2015 when Shannon Phillips first won it, and obviously something that the NDP wants to hang on to, and something that Nenshi wants to hang on to, so he can say, look, I can still win elections. So I guess we'll see what happens when the UCP picks their candidate next Monday, I believe that is, and then we're off to the races. Of course, well, I shouldn't say that. We're actually not off to the races because the provincial government hasn't given us a by-election date yet. It has to happen by January 1st, 2025, because Shannon Phillips resigned, I think it was on Canada Day, and there's a 6-month window they have to hold it. So all this has sort of been happening without, an actual election date being called, which is sort of strange, I suppose. But I would imagine we see that in October and November. No one wants a Christmas election, so that just seems logical.
And NDP leader Nenshi announced his lineup for when the legislature returns, Tyler. Raki Pancholi and Christina Gray join Nenshi on the leadership team. Any surprises with the other appointees?
Yeah, one actually. Kathleen Ganley, she also ran for the NDP leadership and didn't get a critic position. She's going to be sort of chair of engagement on sort of an advisory panel. And the other leadership candidates did get critic portfolios. Sarah Hoffman, for example, is health critic. Jody Callahoo Stonehouse is, I think, the forestry and parks critic. So maybe a bit of a snub to Kathleen Ganley on that one, actually. And of course, Rachel Notley is the wild card here. She is going to be a advisor, basically, to the premier, to the party leader, and she's not the premier. And she is taking her seat in the legislature as far as we know. So that'll be something else to keep an eye on. Does Rachel Notley stick around even though she's no longer party leader, or does she decide to resign and retire?
He's our legislative reporter who sometimes does a Freudian slip, and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal. Thanks for having me.